at any point.
You're mute. What do you mean you're mute?
I can't speak.
This is the silent owner of public places.
Yeah, but feel free to interrupt me or ask any questions as I go, because I know it'd be good to ask those first rather than, because you can lose them by the end.
Okay.
But today I really just wanted to kind of introduce the background that went into the work that I have been performing the last few years with the company Greenleaf that I started, and kind of going into where we got our origin and how a trip to Guatemala for an internship resulted in a concept that I decided to expand when I came back to the U.S. and kind of that concept centered around building as efficient and as effective of a farm-to-table operation and bringing nutrients into people's stomachs and doing that with the least amount of inputs and the fastest output cycle as possible. And trying to do it space efficient using vertical systems was a big factor. In the early project stage, I definitely was kind of limited to what resources I had. At the farm I worked at in Guatemala, they had this, you see the shelf system here, they were using to produce oats and barley for their goats that they were feeding to the goats. And the more they were working on it, the more I noticed it was useful for the livestock, but I was there to do a project for human nutrition and thought it seemed like the perfect system to kind of convert over to microgreen production. And they had been losing a lot of money. The farm hadn't been making much. People weren't buying animals, and they needed a way to sell the plants that they could grow.
They were growing oats in the containers like that? Or?
In the actual trays, they were sprouting seeds, and so they were essentially already growing microgreens. They were just feeding them to the goats and weren't making any money. And so the idea was to grow crops that they could sell at their restaurant they had up on the front of the property. This was a peace center that had a restaurant, an outreach center, a little hotel, and then they had a farm in the back.
So someone given them that idea, or what was their purpose in growing oats like that, just versus in the field? Or?
Definitely, they had been exposed to vertical farming enough. Someone had come and had come up with the idea of it has little gutters underneath that catch the drainage, and so it was already, the system with the rack was already built. And so I just essentially just transitioned a crop and made the connections, talked to the people, and got the production cycle going. And that was some of the teammates that helped me. That's Isabella. She helped a lot. And she was a fellow student from UT that went with me. And the ultimate goal was to get food on the plates in the restaurant, but really to get a revenue cycle going for that farm because they weren't selling anything. And so this is the chef, and so he still consistently buys produce through their production system, and every week he either gets cilantro or radish or some of the varieties that we trialed on that system. But it's nice to know that they're still actually using it, and the reason behind kind of coming up with that market strategy is the basis for it is just a preventative measure to make sure that we get enough nutrients into the public diet as the population centers get more urbanized and more localized around city centers. And we run out of agricultural land and resources, and then it becomes more and more difficult to bring crops from an agricultural rural area into those cities, more and more resources. And so the idea is really just bringing the production center into the city itself and shortening the supply chain. And we're pretty close to the top in terms of percentage living in urban areas. In China, with the world's largest population, is still below 40%. And I think it's an interesting dynamic where they're kind of opposite. Same with India and Eastern Africa, super high populations, especially India and China, but percentage-wise, they haven't bought into the whole urban concept. A lot of problems that we're seeing, again, are urbanization, the scarcity of those resources such as water, like we see in California, where most of our vegetable production actually occurs for U.S. consumption. And they simply don't have any natural source of water where we produce almost all of our lettuce. And the fact that, especially in Guatemala, our focus was on malnutrition-based disease, where people would develop these acute eye issues with cataracts or macular degeneration, and it was just simply that they weren't getting vitamin A. And the reason that the crops were selected was for high vitamin A content, so that just a little bit would hopefully prevent someone from having to get a cataract surgery or losing their vision by the age of 40 in a lot of cases in Guatemala. And then it's like I got back from that trip and thought, the same thing applies here. Maybe we don't have as pronounced or as acute of a health issue with reduced vitamin intakes, but we certainly could benefit from increasing the amount of dietary nutrient intake. And it seemed like the perfect way to do it with these vertical systems, and just noticing how little goes into the product, just seeds and substrate and water and light. And the time that it takes is so rapid that it really, really allows you to make a large impact with little investment. And if your goal is what mine is, and that's to bring nutrients into the diet, maybe not sustenance, that's a whole nother story, but at least to stipend the diet with what key vitamins and minerals it needs. And so the watering system we've been developing at the university is right here, and it just gravity feeds between each shelf, and we get a really precise, even flow rate on each one. And for experimental purposes, that is really something we want. But for the sake of the system we've talked about building, I think we can go a little cheaper and a little bit more effective for what we want. And trying
Where
to
is that?
there's Arrow Farms in New Jersey, and to the point of doing it a little cheaper. And baby greens and different herbs. And they do aeroponics, so they mist the roots as they free hang below the substrate in these big troughs. And every minute or so, it'll kick on a mister.
How do they cut? How do they harvest?
They actually have a patented substrate design that it interfaces with a bunch of angled almost like a bar frame, and the bar frame collapses like an accordion, and so they can really, really quickly broad cut everything and then reel it in, and they've patented the mechanism that they do that with.
I wouldn't be surprised if they have some kind of little conveyors there that allow those trays to come in and out and easily.
Or maybe like a cheese slicer, just go across it, or I'm not sure, but the reason that I put this in here is just to make the point that
vertical farming can be very intense.
Right, yeah, and as you scale up, making these little adjustments to save cost or improve yield, or
that's how you can grow beans.
The scale of that becomes much more. When you do 10,000 units of something, a 1% difference makes a much bigger impact.
Right.
And the market strategy we started with was restaurants, getting a solid distribution network together through the restaurant, letting them deliver from a hub restaurant out to the rest of the franchise. Really saves us in costs and labor. We wouldn't be able to do what we did. We had to deliver across the state. Looking into grocery stores, I think in the future, and smoothie and juice shops would be a huge user of the product if they signed on for consistent product. I know, especially the smoothie and juice shops, because they would use much more per customer as a restaurant would. Long-term partnership development has been a key to our success in developing a single relationship with one very influential client in the state, and his words are that almost nothing could change his opinion of our strategy, our product quality, as long as we do what we say we're going to do. They absolutely love the product, and they have no intention of switching. They have negotiated a price reduction. After about 6 months, they wanted a 20 or 30% reduction in price as we scaled in volume, but we were able to deal with that pretty easily. And then using the research from UT in substrate comparisons, LED light treatments, and analyzing different yields, different varieties based on maybe what level they're on in the room, how close they are to the air source, the ventilation source, has really expanded our understanding of how exactly to grow the plants with no interruption in consistency and quality. Really, 2017 was the beginning in Guatemala, and then as soon as I got back, I started trying to think about how to do it. And about August 2017, got the first client with the restaurant, and the revenues increased a lot next year. And then this year, we've got a pretty professional space now. It's in a basement, but it's got sanitary Mylar plastic all over, and it's got a controlled ventilation. We've got new employees that are doing much better. So it's in their hands, and I'm almost totally hands off. I just really, it's a system improvement is where we're at now. He feeds me problems over the phone, and I make a lot of orders and brainstorm how to approach solving them, and so does he. He's helped a lot. And so this really, hopefully not into 2020. This year we hope to get at least, we're looking into Calhoun's as a potential client, as a large franchise to move across the state. It'd be going with the competitor, but at the same time, I mean, with our mission, it's not to help just one restaurant. It's to help the community get good quality fresh produce. And the community did seem to really like it when we went out and trialed the systems. They'd always just be fascinated with how it watered itself, or just how nutrient dense they were. Most people aren't really aware of the differences in microgreens versus mature plants, where they're often at least 5 times as concentrated in nutrients and can be up to 40 times as concentrated in certain key nutrients. And so it just makes so much sense to stop the production of certain, especially with radish or fast-growing varieties, to offset all of that time and labor and resources and to get the impact you want in a more profitable and a more efficient manner. We know we can increase the amount of certain vitamins in the plants by using certain amount of blue light levels. They've shown, this is research out of Lithuania, and they've shown that using an 8% and 33% blue light as a total amount of light ends up with the highest beta carotene or provitamin A content, where we've got almost a doubling from the original 0%, and then an actual, no, still almost double, but significantly higher.
And why would there be a spike at 8% and then a decline at 16 and 25 is even less than that? Why would that?
Why the trough effect there? I'd be speculating, but I know that the reactions are a product of different pigments that selectively absorb light in that 450 nanometer wavelength region of blue light, and they have a certain capacity and limit to which they can absorb light before they start to degrade, and the metabolic equilibrium will shift away from the products we're talking about, say beta carotene or other provitamins or antioxidants. And then the only thing I can think of is that there may be a synergistic effect between the blue light and potentially just the rapid decrease that you're seeing here may just be inverted as the I honestly, it's hard to say.
Can you ask people?
Yeah.
Just for when you're presenting to other audiences.
It's hard to speculate on exactly. I know that.
But if they publish the results.
Oh, that paper should contain something.
Would have some kind
try
of
to dig it out,
view of why that is.
Because it kind of looks interesting.
But it also depends on what you're going for, because if you're going for beta carotene, and if that's consistent, I don't know how many trials they did, but if that's consistent over time, you'd have to take that into consideration, because if you wanted to maximize, what is that bottom one? Violexanthin?
There's violazanthin here.
Violazanthin.
And so the scale on some of these is off, and I'd like to have more figures to show that. The violazanthin wasn't increased too much. But lutein is another one, the orange line.
They're on different scales. Oh, okay.
So they're on the same scale. It's such a moderate increase, and then a tiny
on the bottom
increase on the bottom.
Tiny,
But the lutein is another one that goes into light filtration in the eye, preventing cataracts, and they've got a tenfold, order of magnitude increase. That's pretty consistent as the blue light increases. And so this is when I say synergistic effect, I should say more. The fact is that the blue light affects all of these compounds almost exclusively in terms of pigments. There's all different pigments that respond to blue light, and they have pathways where they shift in terms of one, there's more of one, say there's more beta carotene, and then as there's less beta carotene, it may shift towards the production of more lutein. So that's what we see here with an increase in lutein, but a simultaneous decrease. So I mean, really, these products can be converted into other forms.
Not now, you can go on, but later on, let's take a look at that study, because I'd like to see the control. Surely they would have done a control like natural light. So how much of a boost are you getting here, or is that the boost versus natural light?
The 0%, I'm fairly certain, is the control with this is a dosage from a natural control light where they're increasing.
And that's a percentage in
the total percentage of pure blue from but I will pull that back up. It's a really interesting paper, and there's more figures than this in there. This is just probably the most, I think, the most significant one.
So the interesting thing about that would be to find somebody in the medical community, because the people that I interface and network with say synthetic vitamins, what you buy on the shelf, have no impact. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry. The question would be whether this has an impact.
The bioavailability. A lot of studies have shown that it is as bioavailable as any other source, especially beta carotene in a normal plant will be just as bioavailable as this increased level.
But if you wanted to do real research on whether this has a physical impact on mitigating all the things you were talking about before, that would be interesting.
Clinical study, or at least a bioavailability study. There are several. I would hate to say specifically what they contain, just because it has been a while since I've looked into those. Those are to me the most important are the blue, the orange, and then alpha tocopherol is vitamin E, and we get about a tripling, a near tripling in the content from 0.77 micrograms per gram to 2.21. You really don't need much of any of these compounds to get a dietary impact. The daily value for beta carotene is maybe 3 milligrams, and so you would only need to eat about 28 grams, or about an ounce of the microgreen product to get the full recommended intake. But when we're talking about people that don't get anything, going from 0 to 10 or 0 to 20, I think makes a lot more of a difference than it.
Okay, cool.
So this is the stuff I researched, comparing the root cube dimensions. So these were all broadcast seeded with cilantro santo seed at the same seeding rate. This study, I had 6 shelves, and each of those shelves had the same temperature, same watering conditions. Really everything was maintained except for the substrate type. So shelf 1 received 1 substrate treatment, and so on, shelf 2 getting its own. And so there were 10 little experiments set across the shelf, each one containing over 60 seeds. And so I pulled 60 seeds from each of the 10 little pads set across the shelf. And comparing the root cube materials, somehow the 1.5-inch root cube always germinated more seeds, consistently had higher germination rates. The hemp, burlap, and coconut performed vastly differently. Coconut was too thick to even wick the water to its surface, so it just, on an NFT, a water-restricted cycle, which is what we wanted to use, was an efficient, low resource input method, and it just simply doesn't work. You need to flood the entire tray to get that to work. But the burlap and the hemp both were pretty good at germinating seeds, but we see the burlap is significantly.
Does that mean the percentage of the seeds that did germinate in the media, or
yes?
What's your
so this here on this side is the rate of germination probability. So there's actual rates I collect of how many did germinate, and then all those samples go into a statistical test to say, with 95% confidence, what's the probability it would occur 95% of the time. Like where would the value fall between? And that's where you have your standard error lines. And so the test just says that we're nearly certain that if you did this test over and over and over again, the value would fall between these. And so when they don't overlap, then they're called statistically different. Because if they overlap, then they're basically saying there's a good chance at least once they're gonna be in the same range, which doesn't allow you to say that they will be different every time you perform the experiment. So we're predicting the future using the actual gathered rates. And these are the same substrates in terms of company. They're both all Oasis in this one, so no natural substrates. So there's a top grooving option here, and then we've got 2 bottom grooving and 3 top grooving. And I've got some here just to show you.
of the scrap?
The bottom grooving is what we use for the basil clubs, and then the top grooving is more like this. And you can just see the top grooving,
That's good.
the higher blue bars, had a much better germination rate just because the seeds were able to get in and actually have an anchor point, whereas on this substrate, the seeds would just knock themselves around. They would just push themselves out.
This is bottom grooving?
This one's the top grooving, and then this one's the bottom grooving.
Oh, I see.
But when you're broadcasting microgreen seeds, it just doesn't make sense to use this because they can't grab.
Why do you even need that hole?
You don't.
Oh, okay.
I don't think you do.
You could have them take that hole out?
Honestly, I thought that having more rows, similar to this substrate, would be more effective because theoretically you've got more space to put seeds than you do if you've got a higher spacing. Because the grooves are the same width and the same length. There's just way more of them on this than that. But the trends we found.
Don't the seeds lay on the surface? And what's the purpose of the grooves then?
So the seeds would definitely.
You were doing microgreen.
Would go into the grooves.
Okay.
They would need to be in the grooves.
Oh, the seeds go into the grooves.
So we just cover the whole thing and actually push them in.
Got it.
But then some are deeper and some are shallow.
Some are on this substrate. There's so little space that there's like 2 seed layers thick. They're on top of each other. Whereas in this substrate there would be a pretty low density of seeds, just one layer thick across the whole thing. And I thought that meant that we'd get better yields and that we'd have better rates of germination. But we found the contrary, where the 1.5 inch, the bigger spacing, somehow results in higher germination rates in all the trials.
Got it.
And as the.
Do you have any pictures using those different cubes?
I do.
So what you're saying is drop the seeds in these grooves, and the fewer grooves, the more of this headspace.
What's in here?
Exactly, headspace.
Yeah. What's in here? Just nothing?
In the hole itself, in the dibble, in the central hole, yeah, you knock everything off this top. Some end up in there, in those, and that's okay. But we mostly
grow it like in square patterns.
And it performed better in germination than burlap. But I think that burlap is a very very effective option. It is much less expensive. It dries out more quickly. So with our plans with shipping, it may not be, but this stuff really does work well. I'd like to show you a picture of how we set it up.
Well, to me, it's just when you drop the seed down below, it's like a ventilation. They just, yeah.
But where's burlap on here?
So this is the first trial, just comparing.
Okay.
Oops, sorry. Comparing the natural and artificial.
Burlap was pretty good.
Burlap was moderately
compared to the 1.5 inch root cube.
This was statistically different from burlap, but these two were in the same statistical group, so we can't say they're significantly different.
60 versus.
Basically, if we ran the experiment again, there's a good chance that burlap would perform better than these.
And this is what? This is percent of germination again?
Mm-hmm. The probability of germination.
And they don't need the Oasis don't make anything that would be sprouts.
They make a substrate. It doesn't work as well as this stuff, and they claim it's less expensive. Will be. It's not on the market yet. It's called polyethyl phthalate, and it's a plastic type, and it's basically an 1/8 inch thick mat. It feels like a sponge material. It's like fibers woven into it. It just doesn't produce that great of yields that I found, and burlap is dirt cheap and does pretty well. And for research purposes, we use this just because we knew that it has such good pore space that it would be uniformly wet, and that was our whole gambit, was consistency and maintenance on those. But there's so that would get 60 seeds, and I would have counted 60, yes or no, and then collected all that into the Excel sheets and use that to make.
And is it overhead irrigation or bottom flooding?
NFT, but just on a very slow cycle, so it would flow from like this. This is our. this was our watering cycle here, and it would flood underneath from the side.
Just that, okay. A film of water.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a film of water, and that thing's angled so that it flows to one end.
And then the drain would come back, and we'd have a catch reservoir and a supply. But really, that trend in the larger spacing gave us better germination rates. Again, when we tested just the horticube, because this material is made of a horticube material. This one's what they call the root cube, and it's an actual different plastic.
Are these plastics?
They're almost like vermiculite is. They heat up, spin it into a fiber, and then they form it into these.
Okay.
That's why they're not organic certified. Is what I've talked to the sales guy that was quite a bit, and that's the only reason I know.
Okay.
But again, with the reduction in germination as we go to the smaller spacing, totally against common sense, I think. But then the difference in yield based on that factor was much more pronounced. We got over double of the yield as we did in the 1-inch horticube versus the 1.5-inch horticube. And then the root cubes just performed better than all 3 horticubes tested in the yield trial as well. Something about this material was superior for getting the seeds to germinate and get the roots in there and to foster initial leaf growth. Something about it. And they don't have enough information specifically on what is contained in there in terms of nutrients.
Well, I think it's more porous. If you look at it, this one is more there's maybe less air.
Yeah, like a larger pore size, more coarse for sure.
Yeah. But they may like better. Just eat for the roots, it's easier to penetrate.
And this was cilantro.
Yeah.
So it's a slow germinating herb, about a week.
Is.
I don't know if that would apply to basil.
Like shell to crack.
I would think it would have some similar effect with basil, since they're both herbs and they both grow at about the same rate, but it's hard to say. This was the yield trials based on light treatments, and I described to Dan earlier. We did a control as just a white LED light, and then for our red and blue supplementation, we basically dialed back the white and then put on just red or just blue light in those treatments. And
that's what per square inch or per flat?
So
the
each
weight.
The weight is per flat. Per actual sheet like this.
It's just, you hear from Mars experience, name your titles, either remove it completely or give it a name and just be more specific. The more, it's just more helpful.
It needs to have everything.
What people do is stare at the slide and they may listen to you, but they may visually be focusing and trying to process what you put there. And you don't need the access titles below, but definitely your Ys need to be titled.
I agree.
Yeah.
So this was your weights. This was the actual.
These were the yields based on the light treatment, and so these are the treatments below, and then the yield in grams on the left side. And we saw when we supplemented with red light versus any of the other individual light, we got the highest yields. We got a slight reduction in yield by basically using our narrow band spectrum, where we took the infrared, the red, the blue, and the ultraviolet lights at what wavelength they were put out by the LEDs themselves. And we ended up with just only those 4 colors of light being applied in an isolated fashion to the crop. We didn't get a reduction in yield, and we had hoped that it would be a more energy efficient way to grow the crop, but it turned out it actually used more electricity and power than the control did. What was interesting was that we got a pretty significant increase in yield using the red light time and time again, but that it used over 10% less electricity than just the white light did.
How did you supplement red with the white? Was that an extra light?
Yeah, it was.
And white light this was a completely controlled light experiment, so you didn't have any natural light.
Exactly. The cabinet was closed, and then the different shelves had opaque plastic so that each shelf level did not interfere with the other.
And is it like 24/7 light, or you had it on a cycle?
12-hour cycle.
12 hours. So
12
hours of
12 hours.
darkness and
Mhm.
then 12 hours of light.
Exactly.
That's another thing that I would do in a presentation like that, just a reminder, and maybe even in every slide that this is cilantro. Another information that's helpful, how long it took you between seeing and analyzing the results. Maybe
Timeline.
something more specific, a bit more specific about plants, about the light cycle.
Mm-hmm.
Whether they were all exposed to natural light for 12 hours or they were in the darkness.
Okay. Yeah, the general background leads to experimental design.
Just a little bit more because it's important for plants. If I'm trying to get something out of it, it's not just the statistical, but it's the overall conditions that it's
Right.
in.
We also analyzed the freeze-dried content, basically taking the samples that were grown on the treatment shelves after a 3-week crop cycle. We took the yields, and then as well as getting the yields, like in the previous figure, we took the same mass, 20-gram sample, and freeze-dried it, and then weighed the content after the full drying process, and then we divided that into the original sample mass that we took, and that gave us a percent of actual dry matter. So if we took the 20 grams, ended up with 1 gram, we divided 1 into 20 and ended up with 5%.
So basically you're trying to get the water out of the
Exactly.
to measure just the mass of what's there.
So that would be any cellular structures that are not water. That would be pigments, flavor compounds, minerals, vitamins, basically quality indicators, but we did not have the capability to individually measure, say, beta carotene or volatile organic compounds. Like for basil, that's a huge quality factor, is how volatile and aromatic the crop is. We saw with the increase in yield from the red treatment here, from the previous slide, we got a significant decrease in dry content.
So the red was actually pumping the plant, the leaf, full of water.
Yeah, overextending its cellular mass to where it's not producing as quality or as strong of a flavor or an aroma. At least that's speculation that's what it, because we didn't measure specifically the volatiles or the flavor compounds.
Right.
But if the water is not involved, then we know that it's going to be something involving quality. Whether
it's back, it was actually the 100% white for the narrow band spectrum. It produced most mass.
Oh yeah, so we got an increase, a significant increase from the narrow band spectrum, which was our whole hope, was that would be a light application strategy that could increase the nutrient content of an herb. We just haven't been able to validate specifically with nutrients that we wanted to that occurred, but this does show that there was some increase in dry mass content, whether that was a mineral or a vitamin or an oil, an essential oil, we can't say.
Very good.
Okay. And yeah, our real goal is just to bring more efficient methods to supply healthy foods to our societies, and that as a growing up wanting to be a doctor, it seemed like the only real way to be a doctor nowadays was to give people good food. Yeah, and that was a great experience collecting all the data. Hopefully it will translate into some useful understandings here, and hopefully it wasn't confusing.
Very good. Thank you.
And those are some of the, there's our first client, the tacos. They use the cilantro. And a sushi restaurant that picked us up for a little while. They ended up dropping because they were so close to a farmer's market. So that was another factor there was.
Farmers markets. Yeah. Cool. Well, that's